Welcome to the public hearing today, February 27th, 2018, which is beginning now at 4 p.m. regarding the Maine Department of Education's periodic review of the science standards in the Maine learning results. This hearing was advertised on February 5th as a priority notice and shared with an extensive list of stakeholders as well as major newspapers and news broadcasts throughout the state. It was again advertised on February 26th through priority notice. This hearing will conclude at 6 p.m. My name is Beth Lambert, and I am the coordinator of secondary education and integrated instruction at the Maine Department of Education. As background for this hearing, this is part of a periodic review of the Maine learning results as required under 6209 subsection 4. The science standards were last reviewed and revised in 2007. The standards review process begins with this initial review of the existing standards. From February 5th until 5 p.m. on March 16th, the Maine Department of Education is collecting public comment on the existing science standards through written comment and these public hearings. At the close of the public comment period, all comments will be given to the Science Standards Steering Committee, which is composed of content area experts who represent the cultural diversity found in Maine and a range of viewpoints as to the content of the standards. This group will meet and review all the comments submitted and develop a blueprint for the revision of the state science standards. Then, this summer, groups of writing teams representing pre-K through 12 science teachers will meet and revise the current standards. In the fall, once the revisions are complete, there will be another public comment period where the public will have the opportunity to comment on the proposed revisions. The procedure for today's hearing is simple. This is an opportunity for the Department of Education to receive comments regarding the current science standards. This is not a discussion. Anyone with comments will please step up here, sign in on the sheet provided, identify yourself, and then state your comment. If you have written testimony or comments with you today and would prefer to submit those instead of speaking publicly, please feel free to do so. And even if you do offer public comment today, we'd appreciate having a copy of your written testimony. We'd also appreciate an electronic copy, if available, of your comments. We may ask you for clarification of your question or comment. Finally, electronic or written comments may be submitted to Beth Lambert, Maine Department of Education, 23 State House Station, Augusta, Maine, 04333-0023, or emailed to sis.doe@maine.gov until 5 p.m. on March 16th, 2018. Thank you for your interest in the science standards and for joining us here today. So we'll get started. Tom, if you signed in, if you want to begin.
I did. You can come up there.
Yeah.
This is being live streamed.
We are live streaming today, so make sure your face is on the computer and everyone will see.
Might break their computer. Perfect. Good. Good afternoon. I handed in my copy, hard copy. I can send it electronically if that would facilitate the process. I'll just have to remember to do it. My name is Tom Keller. I've been a science educator for over 30 years. In that time, I've been a science teacher, a state science supervisor, a school curriculum administrator, a senior program officer at the National Academy of Sciences, and a senior research scientist. This is my personal statement based upon those 30 plus years of experience and do not represent the views of any organization with which I am or was associated. There are four major issues with the current Maine learning results, the MLRs, in science and technology. First is the separation of content and process. The current MLRs are in two different chapters of the law. This has had the unfortunate consequence of splitting science into content in one chapter on federal accountability and process in a different chapter on essential parameters for instruction. This policy requires the exact opposite of where research says we should be, that science needs to engage in the practices, students need to engage in the practices of science to help them understand how science knowledge develops. Secondly, the testing focus is on content. With the content piece of the science MLRs in the chapter on federal accountability, our Maine educational assessment focuses instruction on the teaching of content. The analogy that content is a pile of bricks that need to be skillfully crafted into a structure to be useful is a good one. Content, especially in the 21st century, is not sufficient preparation for a time when critical thinking and innovation use that pile of bricks to build a skyscraper or a Mars launch facility. Thirdly, the MLRs are not informed by current research. Significant research on learning has been undertaken in the past few years and is not reflected in the current MLRs. For example, in many of the pre-K2 standards, there are either no performance indicators or very low-level ones using verbs like identify or observe. Current research shows that kindergartners have sophisticated ways of thinking. Work at the National Academy of Sciences, the premier non-governmental science institution in the country, has released several key research reports since 2007. Fourth, the MLRs are exclusive of engineering. The current MLRs mention engineers once and engineering once. This vital career path is virtually ignored, and Maine students are given no introduction to engineering, yet Maine is begging for more engineers. Maine ranks 49th in national production of engineers with a BS degree. This is an opportunity to show the common lineage of science and engineering and practices core ideas and cross-cutting concepts. As a senior program officer at the National Academy of Sciences, I co-directed development of the framework for K-12 science education. This framework detailed the scientific and engineering practices, disciplinary core ideas, and cross-cutting concepts that students need to know and be able to do to prepare them for the 21st century. So said a committee of 18 comprised of 9 members of the National Academy of Sciences or National Academy of Engineering, including a Nobel laureate in chemistry and 1 in physics, and 9 members who are leaders in their fields of cognition, learning sciences, education policy, education research, and educational practitioners. The veracity of such an esteemed group is beyond reproach. The framework is based on educational research conducted within the past 20 years. Central to this body of research is the agreement that memorizing content is an insufficient background for either career or further study. For true learning to occur, students must engage in science and engineering through practices, as do scientists and engineers, as they consider core ideas and cross-cutting concepts. In today's age of freely available data through Siri or Alexa, facts or content alone are easily located, but it is what students do with these facts, how they learn to think critically with them, that is important. It is more about figuring out than learning about. Ask any educator about what they want in new employees. What they will say is that they want employees who are critical thinkers, ones who can integrate across boundaries, and ones who can communicate effectively and from evidence. Basic knowledge is important, but it is more important that students know what to do with this knowledge. That is what a 21st century set of science learning standards will do for Maine students. Maine teachers have helped create such a set of standards 3 years ago, and most Maine districts have already adopted them and spent considerable amounts of money on the implementation of them. The foundation was the framework of the Next Generation Science Standards, which Maine should review and adopt. Maine teachers can take these standards and create units and lessons by using their creativity. It is time to let Maine students obtain a science education worthy of this century. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you very much. Liz,
Yeah, I'm just gonna
Go to
listen.
wait?
Yeah,
Sure.
for a minute.
anybody else like to share?
I have thoughts. I don't have anything in writing.
You're welcome to come up.
It may be a little more have one extended. But I'll bring, yes, I'll bring visuals. Is the,
You can just sign in.
I already have.
Oh,
I'm number 3.
perfect. You're number 3. There you go.
Yes.
Get your table.
Tom, you're a little tall. So, hi, I'm Margot Murphy. I'm a science teacher at Camden Hills Regional High School. This is my 10th year there, and I was 22 years at Georges Valley, so that gives me a total, I just realized this year, of 32. I'm in my 32nd year. In addition, just a little bit of background, I am also the 1994 recipient of the Presidential Award in Excellence in Science and Math Teaching. Sometime in the last 8 years, I received the Presidential Innovation Award. Last year, I received the SeaWorld's Outstanding Educator Award. And I tell you this mostly because it's been an important part of my practice to get some external evaluation in my process. I'm currently serving as STEM ambassador for the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics and the National Science Teachers Association. And I also serve as chair for the Teacher Advisory Council at the National Academies of Science. And all of that is sort of extraneous to my primary work, which is in the classroom. And I think what has led me down that pathway, it has been my belief in standards, but my evolving relationship with standards. I was involved in the writing team 10 years ago for the current parameters of essential instruction, and felt very excited about that process because we used, at the time, sort of our current understanding of what standards are. So that's where I brought some visuals, which those standards were based on benchmarks and the national science standards, which, 10, 12 years ago, these were the definitive works of the time of how we know people learn science and understand science. And so that writing team was really about taking both those documents and making them fit the context of Maine. And in that time, we adopted standards and we adopted how we're going to assess those standards. And we kind of left the middle of that process empty. We left it up to every school district in the state of Maine to figure out their own homegrown version of how to implement the standards, with a couple of bright spots of people that were able to connect to those, making some gains. But what we've seen is in those 10 years, without that middle part of standards, the conversation about standards becomes about, we can't do them, they're too much, they're too overburdening, there's no way we could afford these. And what happens is that whole conversation about standards being our roadmap gets lost, and we keep kind of villainizing standards. But really, standards should be based on our best understanding of how people learn, how students learn, and sort of the accepted body of knowledge. So this is where we see in those 10 years some other key documents that have come out to play. And one of them was how people learn. And then out of that came Ready, Set, Science. And this document got a lot of traction in the state of Maine, and started really creating some rich discussions about how we do what we do in the classroom. But still, it was sort of little dabbles here and there, nothing with any effort. So then that led, and Tom already mentioned, the framework. This led to sort of the roadmap for what really world-class science and engineering practice can look like. And not just practice, but that learning has to be in this three-dimensional framework. And so out of that was born the Next Gen Science Standards. And I think most of us that have spent time with the framework actually get extremely excited about the potential of the next gen science standards. Until we add how are we going to assess them into the mix, and then everything starts losing its path and losing, like, how are we going to do this? Because so many aspects of what we are trying to accomplish with standards is that middle ground, which means we need to have really high quality materials. And we could argue whether all of our little homegrown versions of our curriculum around the state are high quality or not. I've been in the classroom 32 years, and to be honest, I'm really tired of homegrown. You know, I'm ready for high quality materials that I know have really resonated with kids and have resulted in learning. And then the other part is instructional practices and those pedagogical strategies that we know exist. Some of us have had access and opportunity to practice. Some of us have never heard of them before in our lives. And so how do we actually bring those pieces together? And the beautiful thing is there is community growing around next gen science standards. And I think that no matter what this process takes, we can all agree we want our kids to have, to be strong problem solvers and critical thinkers. And that isn't the debate. The debate is how we're going to get there. And we can continue with our own homegrown versions, or we can really look towards the places that have started practicing with these next gen science standards and the implementation of them, learn from them, utilize the vast amount of materials and resources that are coming out of this, and do something that's going to be very positive for Maine and Maine students. I'll share just two quick stories. One is, both happened last summer. The first was being able to spend a couple of days in Washington at a meeting where people from all over and all walks of the science education forum got together to talk about high quality instructional materials. And what I came out of that meeting with was extremely excited that I think that we actually are on the right path. Like there is momentum growing about what these could look like and what these could be. And it's not one little package, but just this vast, diverse landscape that people can have access that are really built in a very different way. And the second is being able to actually do a training this summer where I spent 8 days with 50 other teachers in the state of Maine. And we spent time actually looking at instructional practice in a way very different than anything I'd ever experienced. So having all these accolades and all these opportunities, at the end of the day, I felt like last summer, 2 experiences said, we have to adopt next gen science so that we can actually start building this capacity of implementation, because all the pieces are at play. We just need to have the roadmap and the go sign so that we can start moving in that direction. So my hope is whatever direction this committee and writing team does, that it is going to be strongly flavored, if not totally flavored, with next gen science standards. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I supposed to sign it? Yes, please.
With my real name?
Yes, please.
Oh, God. Hi. Yeah. My name is Lee Peak, and I'm coming here wearing 2 hats. The first is that I am Chief Education Officer at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. And the second is that I'm chair of the State STEM Collaborative. So I'm going to speak to the, as chair of STEM Collaborative, we're a volunteer organization of STEM organizations from across the state, and I don't come speaking, we don't try to speak with one voice. We really are a network for dissemination of information to all of our members. I just wanted to say that I would say that everything that Tom said, and was it Margot? right, about the next gen science standards reflects the conversation that we've been having for all the years that I've been on the collaborative. So I think it's fair to say that that reflects the tone of what we're hearing statewide from STEM organizations across the state, and all of us in informal, formal, etc. So that's part one. The second part really is coming from a marine research organization. I wanted to speak explicitly, again, in favor of adoption of the next gen science standards or influenced by them. And I want to speak explicitly to the cross-cutting concepts and practices. So it's easy to look at the next gen science standards as a whole, but as a marine research organization, what we see in terms of what our scientists do every day that's most reflected in the standards is this idea that there are higher level concepts that are bigger than any one content nugget that a child might absorb. So, and that those helping kids reach to see how ideas and content ideas connect into these cross-cutting concepts is, from our perspective, and I do speak in terms of also our scientists, one of the most powerful things that we've seen come along in standards recently. The second is the practices. So obviously, as kids leave, we hope that they can leave our programs, we hope they can apply an approach to thinking about the world and thinking about science and applying kinds of practices and habits of mind that, and again, are sort of more important than this particular content nuggets that they absorb. And that those two things working together, I think, are really a powerful aspect of the standards. So I guess I would hate to see the contents part of the standards adopted without linking it tightly together, this idea of cross-cutting concepts and practices. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you. Anybody else like to share today? Or speak? There you go.
Mine's a little bit non-traditional, but that's great. I'm shut for bed.
Okay, so my name's Leslie Tandy. I'm a school counselor at Morse High School in Bath, Maine. I've worked there for the last 13 years, and I'm here today to talk about the science standards with the assessment hat on. So for the last 13 years that I've been working at Morse, we've been administering the SAT and the science augmentation exam. And around that same amount of time, I've been aware of the ACT, which has a science assessment embedded in the test that is administered to students. And one of the things I would love to see as an outgrowth of this review of the standards is to also just reconsider that the ACT with the embedded science assessment might be a better measure that's more meaningful to students and would be a simpler assessment for schools across the state to administer. So I'm just going to speak for a minute about that, because as a school counselor, in addition to the SAT, which is a school-based assessment and takes pretty much most of the day and disrupts the school and kids have to go to different rooms and things like that, we also have to administer this science assessment. So that's a second day and it's 3 hours. And even some of our brightest students who have taken a very broad and rich science curriculum will say, why am I taking this science assessment? Because they understand what the SAT is all about, but they don't understand what the science assessment is. And they want to know, why are they taking it and what's the purpose of it? And so I have a few concerns about it, because in addition to the fact that it doesn't have meaning to kids, I wonder how much educators are actually using the information that's been gathered these last several years to evaluate their practices and maybe revise how they're teaching students. I know within our own school, the science test scores have not been reviewed the last several years. This recent year, we didn't receive science reports from the state. We had to log into a system and report those reports out, and then share those with families if we wanted to do that. I'm wondering if other school systems across the state knew to log in and print the reports. We didn't receive stickers for the first time for the science report. So I'm just wondering, like, we've got this science assessment, how much is it valued? How much is it useful? recently a mom's contacted me because I'd been in touch with her about mid-year reports for her daughter and making sure I had all the good information to share in a mid-year report to a college. And she had recently received the science report because we had realized now how to get at it and how to send it out to families. And she said she did quite well on the science test. And I said, well, that was a test she took in last April. And it doesn't have meaning for a college. A college does not know what the Maine science augmentation exam means. Colleges know what an ACT science score means. The ACT also has a STEM score that combines the math and science content areas. And I know that that's a big initiative for the state of Maine, wanting to grow engineers, wanting to have some strong STEM information. Right now, 8% of Maine students take the ACT. It's the lowest percentage in the country. The next lowest state is like at 18%. So kids are underutilizing this resource. And so I would just ask, as you review the science standards, if you'd consider also how are we assessing the kids on those science standards, and might the ACT be a better resource for that? It's a test that's been researched over 50 years, and when you achieve a 23 on the science ACT, that means you have a very strong likelihood of be a better on your entry-level biology class in college. So it really has some great meaning for students that do take it, and that's what I wanted to share. Do you have any questions for me? Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Would anyone else like to speak? Sure. Sign there.
Can I ask a question? If I wanted to revise my statement,
You sure
I
can send it. Absolutely.
Because I'm like, I might not speak now.
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry, you have to read it verbatim.
Well, I could do that part, but it might like later think of other things.
Yeah,
so.
absolutely. Yep. All right,
Does this all work?
you're all set.
I'm on. Oh, okay.
You're on.
Thanks. My name is Christine Anderson Morehouse, and I started my career in science education as a middle-level science teacher. I was a statewide science facilitator in the 1990s during the first iteration of the Maine learning results, and I was part of the development and revision of that process. I was a science consultant across the state of Maine during the 2000 adoption of the new science learning results, which are our current standards. And I've also worked closely with districts in the Mid-Coast region for many years as their professional development director during the time when districts were beginning to work toward the proficiency-based diploma system for graduation. I have a lot of experience with science standards, developing them, interpreting what they're intended to look like in the classroom, using them to design curriculum. And I really believe that each upgrade has come at a time when new information about teaching and learning meant that the new standards would better serve the needs of students and teachers. Originally, I think the standards were kind of meant to make sure that all students had the opportunity to learn the same standard no matter which part of the state of Maine they lived. And that was very important to me as a teacher to be sure that I was teaching what was the most important. It was a matter of fairness. The existing learning results adopted in 2007 was a huge improvement at the time because they were based on the newer documents that Margot has already showed, the benchmarks for science literacy, the national science standards, and they were provided a lot of guidance. However, they required to be implemented, they really required fairly elaborate crosswalk documents so that as a teacher, I could be sure that I was interpreting and understanding each of the performance indicators in the way that it was intended to be learned by students. And also at the time in the standards that we have, a concern that I have is that the skills and traits of science inquiry, what we call the processes of science, are separate, which means that I may choose to teach those skills and traits of science separately. For example, it's not that uncommon at the beginning of a school year to have a complete unit of how to use the science method, and then never really deeply work on that process again. So it's challenging to think that the standards that we have that we're using at the beginning of this revision process might be those standards when we've come a long way since then. So where we are now is we've moved on to the place where instead of thinking about this is what I teach, I'm going to use the standards to help me think of what I teach my students. We're at a place now where the standards are really about what students are going to learn and what they're expected to know and be able to do to graduate. It's not that we give them assessments. It's not that we give them credits for attending a course that address the standards. It's that they actually have to cross that line in the sand that I will tell them, yes, you've met those standards, whatever they are, or no, you have not, you cannot graduate. And so the question becomes, what are the most important things for a student to understand and be able to do in order to graduate, whether they're going to go on to become a scientist or an engineer, or whether they're going to become a citizen of Maine who isn't in that field of science. So we want to make darn sure that those lines in the sand are important. And what I've experienced in my work with districts is that many of them have begun to adopt the practices of the next generation science standards as their graduation standards. And one of the reasons being that those are significant, enduring pieces of knowledge and ways of thinking and ways of understanding the world. And another reason is because within the next gen science standards, because those science standards are so intertwined, if I as a student want to be able to show evidence that I can make and use models, for example, there are many different areas across physics, across earth science, across life science, within which I can find those performance expectations. Excuse me, that's old language. But anyway, I can take those individual concepts intertwined with practices, and I can take from my portfolio and put together a body of evidence from which I can prove that I'm ready to graduate, that I'm ready to cross those lines in the sand. So because, and I agree with what others have said, that there are so many great resources, there's so much support that's coming online in terms of best practices for teaching, in terms of possible course models and pathways, all of those resources that are available to us if we were to work with some set of standards based on the next gen science standards, we would be in a very good place in terms of science for students of Maine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask her a question?
He's going to say, how old are you? How long have you been around doing this stuff?
Would anyone else like to speak? Well, the hearing will continue until 6 o'clock, so you have time if you reconsider and would like to speak. You're welcome to stay, and other people may be joining us as they get out of school or work, so we'll be here. You're welcome to stay as well. And know that it will continue to record in this room, so if you want conversations, they should. You can go outside of the room and come back in as you like. There are restrooms outside as well in the hallway.
So the people who are Zooming can just receive, they can't send, they can't?
Correct.
Okay.
The live stream allows them to view and hear, but not participate. Yeah. But people can always participate on written comment.
Correct. Got it.